Woke culture is one of the most controversial phenomena in the contemporary Western world. Although its roots lie in postmodernist philosophical theories developed in 20th century France, its full flowering occurred in the United States at the beginning of the 21st century, where it penetrated from academic debates into media, politics, non-governmental organizations, corporations, and everyday life. From seemingly noble postulates of equality and social justice, it transformed into an aggressive ideology that deeply penetrated the social fabric of Western countries. It led to phenomena such as the promotion of gender change in children, radical queer activism, and uncritical acceptance of immigration. This phenomenon has divided societies, affecting public debate, identity politics, and everyday interpersonal relations. However, recent years, and in particular Donald Trump's rise to power, represent a kind of counter-revolution against the woke movement. What was woke ideology? What has it become? And are we now witnessing its death? Welcome to the 20s Report. Consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the video to aid the algorithm. Although in its current form the mainstream of woke ideology derives from the United States, its roots are found in France. The main pillar of wokeism is postmodernist philosophy and postmodernist relativism. Postmodernist philosophy was developed especially by Michel Foucault, born in Poitiers in 1926 to a wealthy medical family. In his philosophical career, Foucault focused on fighting against medicine, the education system, and the prison system. He had a particular obsession with power relations between people and analyzed many areas of potential oppression by those with greater power against those positioned lower. For contemporary woke ideology, in addition to the ideas of discrimination and victim status, the language of information transmission is also important, and this is created by people who have power. Therefore, according to wokeists, there is no objective empirical reality and its description, but only a narrative of powerful people. Quote, "Power produces knowledge. Power and knowledge directly imply one another. There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations." Foucault wrote in Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. Foucault also criticized the institution of police, including in the essay The Games of Power. Crime is too useful for anyone to dream of such an absurd and ultimately dangerous thing as a society without crime. Without crime, there is no police. What allows the population to accept police presence, police control, if not fear of the criminal? It is a wonderful windfall. He and only he justifies this so new and so powerful institution, writes Foucault. Another major proponent of postmodernism was the Frenchman Jacques Derrida. He incorporated postmodernist relativism into the philosophy of postmodernism. He argued that everything is relative. He turned the answer "it depends" into heuristic and rhetorical tools, making substantive debate difficult or impossible. He created a system of negating the meaning of any word, phenomenon, or their context that somehow did not fit postmodernism. "There is nothing outside the text," goes Derrida's famous quote. Today we see distraction in woke culture's negation of phenomena such as gender, obesity, race, or mental disorders. But Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida were not the only precursors of wokeism. Jean-François Lyotard, born in Versailles, was called the Pope of postmodernism, who criticized the Enlightenment along with its typical values of development of natural sciences and humanism. Jean Baudrillard, who focused on the idea that the contemporary world is a collection of copies and imitations, was also among the icons of this philosophy. Postmodernist philosophy grew on such foundations. It gained popularity in Europe, but above all, it flourished in the United States. First at universities. Already in the 1980s and 90s, Fields of study that are not scientific from the perspective of empirical and objective sciences appeared with increasing frequency. We can mention gender studies, post-colonial studies, queer studies, fat studies, disability studies, and neurodiversity studies. This collection of quote studies is generally called critical studies because they engage in the destruction of meanings, facts, and history within the framework established by Derrida, while also examining them for patterns of discrimination in line with Foucault's emphasis on victim narratives. On American campuses and in the liberal and leftist press, specific areas of woke ideology began to be forged, including primarily gender and queer ideology. One of the key figures here is the feminist American philosopher Judith Butler, author of the book Gender Trouble and the main proponent of the idea that gender is a social construct. Another author, Robin DiAngelo, became famous for so-called whiteness studies, a current that considers whiteness a social construct that is inherently privileged and therefore racist. She wrote the best-selling book White Fragility. Quote, "Being good or bad is not important. Racism is a multi-layered system embedded in our culture. Each of us is socialized in a system of racism. Racism cannot be avoided. Whites are blind to racism. I too am blind to racism," she argues. The role of antagonizing blacks against whites is played by black author Ibram X. Kendi, who is extremely popular in America. Directs institutions focused on, quote, researching racism and lectures at universities. He has gone so far as to publicly claim that the HIV virus was invented by whites to eliminate black people. The mainstream of woke culture also includes the obesity movement, also known as fat feminism, which proclaims obesity as a positive phenomenon, and treating it as a disease is called fat phobia. Fat activists organize, for example, boycotts of Olympics, which they consider a fat-phobic promotion of athletic figures. Quote, "Every person who lives in a fat-hating culture inevitably absorbs anti-fat beliefs," argued fat studies researcher Marilyn Wan. Meanwhile, fat feminist comedian Sophie Hagen accused the British institution Cancer Research of fat phobia for organizing a social campaign raising awareness that obesity increases the risk of cancer. Woke has also evolved towards views in which prostitution and pimping are considered normal professions, and the prohibition of prostitution or prosecution of pimps is a form of discrimination. For proponents of wokeism, even the word prostitution is considered, quote, slut-shaming, and they prefer the term sex worker. Christianity is also widely criticized, as it contradicts many doctrines of wokeism. Paradoxically, however, the group stands in defense of Islam, and criticism of expansiveness, aggression, and Islamic terrorism is labeled as Islamophobia. Opposition to illegal immigration is, in woke culture, an example of, quote, fascism. In Canada, a particular branch of wokeism turned out to be the approach to drug addiction. For more than 20 years, Canadian authorities, led by British Columbia, have been conducting an experimental drug policy, a very liberal one. Clinics were established where addicts can inject heroin under the supervision of professional staff. Safely, as was argued. Clean drugs are provided for free, and a blind eye is turned when someone smokes crack in public spaces. The number of deaths from overdose is increasing, wrote journalist and writer living in Canada, Margaret Seeds. Any criticism of such a policy, called, quote, harm reduction, was considered a form of discrimination against drug addicts. Oversensitivity on this point was combined with the fact that a significant percentage of addicts in Canada are Indigenous people, who, for historical reasons, have special rights. Given the fact that, in accordance with woke ideology, everything is relative and depends on how someone subjectively identifies, there have been cases where able-bodied people began to identify as disabled, use wheelchairs or damage their bodies to actually become disabled. Despite the lack of compatibility with reality and the scientific method on which human progress is based, woke began to dominate the spectrum of humanities, while these began to morally dominate American campuses. As wokeism developed its own concepts across many fields, it simultaneously created mechanisms to defend these ideas against criticism. This is how the so-called cancel culture emerged. Students increasingly demanded a ban on debates if one side had non-woke views. When lecturers expressed themselves differently than the main commandments of wokeism, for example, acknowledging the existence of biological sex, or critically approaching Islam in Quran analysis classes, they were victims of harassment or reports to the administration. This is well illustrated by the example of Kathleen Stock, a British philosopher. Stock spoke out against the Gender Self-Identification Act, which allows gender change based on a declaration at an office, without any psychiatric and psychological examinations. In response to Kathleen Stock's statements and texts, students organized a witch hunt against her at Sussex University. Posters against her were hung, hostile letters were left at her door, and she was shouted at in campus alleys. Other lecturers stopped saying hello to her, and even signed a petition to expel her from the university for transphobia. Defamatory posts appeared on social media, and she was accused of hatred towards transsexuals. Ultimately, Kathleen Stock resigned from Sussex University, fearing for her own health. When her story was publicized in major media outlets such as BBC or The Guardian, she was invited to lecture at Oxford University. Because she received threats from trans activists, she came to the lecture escorted by several security guards. The phenomenon of cancel culture took an exceptionally aggressive form towards journalists and public figures. New York Times editor Adam Rubinstein left the editorial office after becoming the target of attacks following the publication of a text about using the army to restore order in the streets, which were being destroyed and looted by Black Lives Matter activists. Liberal columnist Matthew Iglesias left Vox magazine after a lynching for his statements criticizing the defunding of police in connection with Black Lives Matter's protests, as well as criticizing saying, quote, Latinx instead of Latinos. The form of Latinx is, according to wokeists, a form conducive to non-binarity. Such situations have become common throughout the West in the last decade, and the woke revolution did not spare even the dead, leading to toppling of monuments. Woke supporters labeled as racists and fascists, among others, former US presidents, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, or one of the most important biologists in history, Charles Darwin. When these specific views were a deep niche, they had little impact on the everyday life of the average person. However, when they began to spread from the beginning of the 21st century, first at American and British universities, and then also in the rest of Europe, their influence increased dramatically. Woke culture began to permeate the media, even center-right outlets. Simultaneously, it won the hearts of politicians in the Democratic Party in the USA, Labour and Liberal Democrats in the UK, Greens, SPD in Germany, Civic Platform and the Left in Poland, the Liberal Party of Canada, or Podemos and Social Democrats in Spain. Particularly intriguing is the story of the fantasy world superstar, J.K. Rowling. In 2019, she stood up for Maya Forstater, who lost her job for stating that sex cannot be changed. Then Rowling also wrote that saying, quote, menstruators or people without a uterus instead of a woman is not appropriate. In response, she faced a wave of criticism, hate and even threats. She began to be excluded from programs. Some actors playing the main roles distanced themselves from the writer and criticized her, which Emma Watson, who played Hermione in the films, did particularly fervently. Trans activists at one point began publishing photos of Rowling's home in Scotland on social media, implying that she could not feel safe. The conflict about gender moved from media and universities to the common spaces of ordinary people. New scandals kept erupting when men identifying as women began to appear in women's locker rooms, bathrooms, or changing rooms in all US states or EU countries. In various Western countries, men also began to be transferred from male to female penitentiary facilities if they identified as women. One of the most high-profile cases was transgender Scott Isla Bryson, biologically male, who raped 2 women in 2016 and 2019 and then was placed in a women's prison. This scandal, combined with Scotland's preparation of a new legislation facilitating gender change, led to the fall of Scottish Prime Minister Nicola Sturgeon in 2023. Woke culture also led to gays and lesbians being thrown out of equality parades for their alleged transphobia. A stark example was the lynching of a gay activist during an equality parade in the capital of Vermont. Trans activists knocked down 74-year-old Fred Sargent, poured coffee on him, trampled and destroyed his banner criticizing the trans movement. Woke culture also established itself in the mainstream during Black Lives Matter protests, especially after the killing of George Floyd. In response to this event, there were anti-racist protests throughout the United States. However, these were not ordinary anti-racist marches, but often violent riots. At the same time, BLM activists demanded a reduction in funding for the police or removal of the police institution, which coincides with Michel Foucault's arguments. Authorities in many places bowed to this pressure by reducing funding for law enforcement services. There was strong pressure from Democrats, media, universities, corporations, and non-governmental organizations not to criticize the riots, disturbances, and demands, even if they involved violence and destruction. The wokeist Me Too movement also gained significance, within which there was a wave of false accusations of molestation or rape, mainly from women. Often celebrities, influencers, or activists writing Me Too on social media became a form of gaining popularity, likes, and drawing attention to oneself. The results were lamentable. Actual cases of molestation and rape at work in all institutions, which should be held accountable, were covered up by influencers or activists announcing Me Too en masse or resorting to specific public false accusations. Meanwhile, the attempt to convince society that looking at a woman for too long is molestation or rape blurred the meaning of these words. Because if a look was rape, then what do you call an actual rape? From one side, wokeists fight against rape culture, but on the other hand, they hinder or prevent criticism of actually systemic sexual violence in Islamic culture, where there are instances of marrying off little girls, polygamy, seen by wokeists as, quote, polyamory, as well as physical violence and abuse against homosexual individuals. Publicly raised voices that such relationships should be prohibited in European countries and are tolerated in London, Berlin, Stockholm, Paris, or The Hague were immediately countered with accusations of Islamophobia, xenophobia, and racism. For the same reason, the problem of Islamic Pakistani pedophile gangs, whose victims included thousands of British girls and young female immigrants in the UK, was swept under the rug. In parallel, large corporations began to attach themselves to all woke movements. Not only technology companies, but also clothing, pharmaceutical, food, biotechnology, furniture, banking, or transportation conglomerates. Corporations began to establish DEI units, standing for diversity, equity, and inclusivity, within which reporting on co-workers for alleged racism, transphobia, or fatphobia was facilitated. DEI centers ensured that black people or men identifying as women were treated better during recruitment. Jars with tampons for transsexual men and women identifying as non-binary began to be placed in men's restrooms in offices. At some point, most Americans or Europeans, including often those with center-left or moderately liberal views, also began to be classified by mainstream activists, journalists, and politicians as fascists or far-right, because they did not deny the existence of two sexes, because they did not agree to additional recruitment points for dark skin color, because they did not like the idea of abolishing the institution of police. Over time, the entire movement began to evolve into such grotesque forms that even its proponents began to get lost in it. IKEA Poland once issued a quote lexicon of good language, in which it argues that complimenting a black person for speaking Polish well is a manifestation of racism, but complimenting a foreigner of different skin color is not racism. The whole point is that this practice was transferred from American guides on inclusivity. It stems from the observation that actually racist Americans artificially compliment African Americans for good American English, to emphasize that using this language well is not something natural for African Americans. Pointing out such barbs may in some contexts be justified, but creating a handbook of good behavior for the entire world on this basis is absurd. And thus, wokeism undermines the sense of unity based on a shared humanity. It also largely rejects unity within the nation-state framework. Instead, it fragments society, while paradoxically promoting solidarity around singular identity traits: gender, race, obesity, or transsexualism. This fragmented approach to identity in woke culture ultimately weakens broader community bonds. In this way, the influence of woke culture on society began to be very significant, and since this movement was achieving social success, it was followed by media, corporations, and politicians. Within identity politics, people were hired for work and recruited to studies not necessarily evaluated on the basis of competence, but on the values proclaimed by woke. During Joe Biden's presidency, the White House hired Rachel Levine as an assistant secretary for health, an admiral in the US Uniformed Health Service, who changed gender. In 2024, it was revealed that during her service in the White House, she pressured medical organizations to lower the recommended age for gender change. And while at some point in history, the campaign promoting wokeism might have been politically profitable, it eventually began to be a burden. It is impossible not to notice that Kamala Harris's close ties with the movement had a significant impact on her defeat in the 2024 presidential election. Kamala Harris advocated for supporting the gender change movement, the presence of men identifying as women in women's locker rooms and in women's sports. On Twitter, she set pronouns for herself, which is a form of signaling that one supports woke culture in the transsexual current. Kamala Harris was criticized even by some feminists, who pointed out that by recognizing men as women, the number of women rapists in police statistics is rapidly increasing. The percentage of men identifying as women present in women's prisons is also increasing. Quote, 15% of women in prisons are transgender women, the New York Times recently reported. Kamala Harris was also unable to criticize BLM actions when activists were demolishing public spaces in Minneapolis, Denver, Chicago, or New York. However, Harris's embrace of woke ideology failed to mobilize black voters, as she received less support from this demographic than either Hillary Clinton in 2016 or Joe Biden in 2020. She also experienced significant erosion in Latino support. Of course, other factors also contributed to Kamala Harris's defeat, related to migration, the economy, and organizational issues in connection with Joe Biden's forced resignation. However, Kamala Harris's support for wokeism seems to be one of the main elements that contributed to her defeat. Donald Trump, who promised to ban children from changing gender or placing men identifying as women in female prisons, gained the votes of those dissatisfied with woke culture. He critically referred to Black Lives Matter protests and broke with the rhetoric of self-flagellation on the international arena due to the past mistakes of colonialism. Although conflicts over transsexuality have become frequent and loud throughout Europe, Migration and Islam are the main political disruptors on the old continent. Criticism of the creation of parallel societies was suppressed from above. Skeptical voices were until recently unthinkable, despite increasingly frequent gigantic scandals, such as mass New Year's Eve rapes in Germany, additionally justified by German imams. The breaking of the social fabric also includes the previously described pedophile gangs in Great Britain, growing crime in France and the Netherlands, Islamic no-go neighborhoods in Sweden, assaults on gays in Spain, marriages of adult men to girls in the UK, or regular attacks in Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Stockholm, and other cities. In mainstream media, criticism of wokeism became inadmissible. Anyone who expressed skepticism or opposition to this situation was aggressively stigmatized. The entire repertoire of woke ideology was activated. Such a skeptic was called a fascist, racist, Islamophobe, or xenophobe. Woke culture in the form of unwavering support for immigration prevailed in the European mainstream. At the European level, the theoretically conservative European People's Party, from Ursula von der Leyen's comes, also strongly supported a significant part of woke culture's demands, led by uncritical tolerance of Muslim immigration, the transsexual movement, or wokeist post-colonialism, according to which Europe should apologize for its ancestors. This led to a situation where the far right, as the only one speaking loudly about apologies, is gaining importance and receiving increasing social support. This is visible throughout Europe, but it is not known where this will lead. Will the governments of far-right and nationalist parties contribute to European integration? Or rather to the disintegration of European ties, or worse, to conflicts? The Russian Federation and the Communist Party of China benefit most from the weakening of European integration. A divided European Union, in which internal border controls are being restored instead of protecting external borders, is a dream come true for Russian imperialism. The woke movement itself, by forcing the European Union to promote Muslim immigration or the legality of changing children's gender, presented the Russian Federation with yet another gift. In the face of the prevalence of the woke movement, the Kremlin and the associated Russian Orthodox Church began to self-identify as the world bastion of Christianity. Anti-LGBT rhetoric has been permanently inscribed in the argumentation of the war with Ukraine and the broader understood West as a fight against satanic people. The Kremlin's disinformation apparatus very skillfully began to use this narrative, which found fertile ground in the United States, including figures such as Tucker Carlson, who became a staunch promoter of Russia as a conservative enclave, or Jordan Peterson, who from a critic of woke, but also totalitarian regimes, became an element of the Kremlin's war against Ukraine, claiming that NATO is responsible for starting the war. Of course, the facts totally contradict the alleged narrative presented by the Kremlin. Participation in religious services in Russia is at a lower level than in many countries of the, quote, degenerate West, including the Netherlands, Great Britain, or Germany, not to mention Poland or Romania. The same applies to the number of abortions, which in Russia are significantly higher than in the USA or Europe, and in Russia as many as 2/3 of marriages end in divorce. Let's add that in many places in Russia, for example in Murmansk, there is a huge percentage of people with fetal alcohol syndrome, which means that many Russian women drink alcohol during pregnancy. All these data contradict the image created by the Kremlin, but it nevertheless proved effective. Today, leading faces of the new American administration, such as J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, or Tulsi Gabbard, look at Russia quite positively, among other things due to this artificially created image. However, as quickly as woke established itself in Western societies, equally quickly a kind of counter-revolutionary process began to take place. Social media accelerated the spread of woke culture and its implementation into the official policies of universities, non-governmental organizations, corporations, and state institutions. However, when the winds of change blew, they accelerated its downfall. Since woke culture spread most extensively in the area of the transsexual movement, naturally, it begins to be rejected first. Finland banned gender change for minors in 2020. In 2021, the Karolinska Institute, known for awarding the Nobel Peace Prize in Medicine or Physiology, banned it in its hospitals. In 2022, all other facilities in Sweden followed its example. In 2023, Denmark announced restrictions on gender changes, and the Norwegian Health Commission, EUCOM, issued a report recommending that legislation be introduced similar to Finland and Sweden. Among the reasons cited was the simply incomprehensible number of teenagers declaring themselves transsexual. In the UK, the increase was 4,400% over 10 years. In Belgium, 4,200% in 15 years. In Sweden, 1,700%. Quote, "From one day to the next, at Gregorio Marañón Hospital, we are witnessing a sudden explosion in the number of teenagers claiming to be transgender. What was once rare, just 1 or 2 cases per year, in our world, has become remarkably common, with 15 to 20% of all admitted adolescents now identifying as transgender. For many of these teenagers, this appears to be influenced by social trends rather than genuine gender dysphoria," said psychiatrist Professor Celso Arango in an interview with the Spanish newspaper El Mundo. In 2022, British authorities closed the Tavistock Clinic, which changed children's gender. The decision was made in connection with an increasing number of lawsuits for mutilation after these children grew up and began to understand what had been done to them. Also in 2022, the French Academy of Medicine issued a statement warning against gender change procedures. In 2024, the entire United Kingdom banned gender change for minors, which was also supported by Social Democrats from the Labour Party. At the beginning of this year, Donald Trump signed an order to stop funding gender change for people under 19 years of age from federal funds and announced further work on banning gender change for children. During all these legislations, further scientific studies were published showing that gender change does not improve patients' mental state, but worsens it, and also causes irreversible health changes. A number of investigations were also published. A journalist writing for the New York Times, Jesse Singal, discovered that in studies that were supposed to confirm that gender change is beneficial for health, results and conclusions were falsified. The data showed no improvement, but rather deterioration. But in the results and conclusions, scientists wrote that patients showed clear improvement. Departure from woke culture is also visible in sports. Initially, local bans on men's participation in women's sports were introduced by organizations operating at universities. Soon, individual US states began to enact such bans, and currently, the White House and the American Parliament are working on a nationwide ban. They argue that biological males maintain physical advantages over females in sports regardless of gender identity or medical interventions. These advantages stem from testosterone's effect on muscle development, bone density, joint structure, and cardiovascular capacity. Effects that begin during fetal development and create lasting physiological differences that hormone therapy and surgery cannot fully eliminate. England Hockey introduced a ban on transsexuals in women's hockey. World Athletics also introduced a ban on the presence of men in women's competitions at their events. A similar decision was made by the World Aquatics Organization. Well-known transgender swimmer Leah Thomas responded by accusing those who oppose transgender participation in women's sports of transphobia. The controversy expanded following several incidents at the 2024 Paris Olympics, prompting boxing federations to formally consider restrictions. Similar policy discussions have since emerged among governing bodies for football, volleyball, and numerous other sports disciplines. Signs of change are also visible in LGBT organizations, from which their members began to depart. Gays and lesbians began to establish new LGB organizations. For example, LGB Alliance, Get the L Out, Gays Against Groomers, etc. They deliberately reject transsexualism and queer, considering that linking gender identity disorder with homosexual orientation is inappropriate. They also oppose changing children's gender and refunding gender change through the public healthcare system. The case of Maya Forstater, who lost her job after stating that biological sex cannot be changed, and whose cause J.K. Rowling publicly supported, concluded with a significant legal victory. The tribunal ultimately ruled in Forstater's favor and awarded her approximately £100,000 in compensation for wrongful dismissal. A teacher from Virginia also won a case for wrongful dismissal, which he received for refusing to speak to boys as if they were girls, and to girls as if they were boys. British nurse Sandy Peggy was subjected to disciplinary proceedings and suspended from work for refusing to use a locker room together with a transsexual doctor, who identified as a woman. The nurse believes that forcing her and other female employees to be by the employer to change clothes in the presence of a man is harassment, and suspension from work for refusing to change clothes in the presence of a man is a violation of labor law. The woman has initiated proceedings in the labor court, and although the case is still ongoing, the court ruled that it would not punish her for referring to the transsexual doctor as a man, which also heralds a change in approach. A thaw is also visible in Europe. The wokeist rhetoric that the European Union has an obligation to admit anyone who wants to enter and also give benefits to newcomers is beginning to collapse. Sweden, even during the previous social democratic government, tightened immigration law, limiting the possibility of bringing families, which also covered refugees. Germany, which 10 years ago under Angela Merkel's government fueled the process of migrant influx, is now making a 180-degree turn, closing internal borders and thus undermining the foundations of the EU collective, the Schengen area. Moreover, corporations and even universities are abandoning or cutting back on woke culture programs in the form of DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion. Among universities limiting or abandoning DEI are Stanford University, University of Texas, University of Florida, and many others. Among the increasing number of corporations abandoning DEI are Walmart, McDonald's, Boeing, Toyota, or Caterpillar. The rebuilding of social trust in public institutions will take time, but the process of change has begun. The climate of censorship and cultural authoritarianism will eventually disappear from universities, at most remaining in the most zealous humanities departments. Corporations will increasingly less often whitewash their image with statements about supporting non-binary people. Moving away from woke culture is certainly not good news for the Russian Federation and China. Playing Western societies according to the divisions of identity politics was exceptionally easy. It is worth recalling that when Vladimir Putin praised J.K. Rowling for criticizing the transgender movement, which was an obvious way to fuel unrest on this background in Great Britain, the writer quickly criticized the Russian dictator, rejected his support, and continued to openly support Ukraine. And so, today there is no doubt that the woke movement is in retreat. We also know the symbolic date of the mass rejection of this ideology, November 5, 2024, when Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris. Trump built the foundation of his campaign on strong anti-woke rhetoric, and as the election showed, this is exactly what voters expected. A return to the classic family pattern, rejection of DEI programs, including within the military, cuts in funding for transsexual ideology, etc. The nomination of Pete Hegseth for the position of Secretary of Defense, whose main postulate was to cleanse the army of woke ideology, despite his weak competencies, was sufficient to take a position at the top of the world's strongest army. And this is a potent symbol of how deeply woke penetrated state structures, and how the revolutionary movement elevated its most ardent opponents to the top. It is worth recalling here one of the main reasons why the Tories in Great Britain failed to win the 2024 election, even though they also focused on the issue of fighting woke, especially changing children's gender or illegal immigration. Well, the Tories had ruled continuously for many years before. It was during their rule that Islamic crime, trans activism, fat feminism, neurodiversity, normalization of prostitution and pimping, and other woke pathologies spread. Their sudden opposition was therefore not credible, and the British saw that there were many supporters of this ideology within the Conservative Party. The second reason is that the Labour Party, which won a clear victory last year, also advocated banning gender change for children and limiting immigration. In other words, they did not make the mistake that Kamala Harris and the Democrats made. Observing all the commotion from the sidelines, one can recall the good old proverb: "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." There is no doubt that supporters of woke ideology had or have good intentions. They demanded respect for human rights, human diversity, or freedom of expression. However, during this process, with low awareness of its members, the entire movement quickly degenerated. These good intentions were made into a kind of weapon and an element of the struggle for power. Moral superiority allowed dethroning people with different views, somewhat forgetting about the freedom of the other side. Value signaling became the same thing that the whole movement was supposed to fight against according to its assumptions. Woke supporters presented themselves as people higher in the hierarchy of values, looking down on people with an opposite view of the world. Moreover, penetration of the world of academia, corporations, NGOs, and media, and thus over time politics, gave them real power and influence on reality. As a result, morality was only a useful tool to reach a goal as old as the world, that is, power. The problem is that the entire edifice was from the beginning set on shaky foundations, because it was simply contrary to reality and the laws governing this world. Questioning the two sexes and policies supporting their change, fueling social chaos, cancel culture, or covering up the negative effects of Islamic migration led to real damage in the social fabric of states. In the USA and UK alone, the number of mutilated children as a part of gender change is already several tens of thousands. The effect of woke culture's actions was measurably negative at the individual level as well as for larger communities. When the number of victims and opponents crossed the quote point of no return, it was clear that woke ideology was collapsing. Trump correctly diagnosed the counter-revolutionary wave and rode it into the White House. After him, the entire big tech opportunistically adjusted course, with Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook leading the way. With the advent of Trump's presidency, Zuckerberg announced withdrawal from diversity and inclusivity programs, reducing censorship and removing tampons from men's restrooms in Meta offices. There is no doubt that woke culture significantly weakened the structures of the broadly understood West, exposed it to penetration of foreign powers' influence, and based many of its directions of development on empirically incorrect assumptions. In this context, woke ideology has contributed significantly to both economic underperformance and intellectual decline among Western elites. When decisions were based on values that were subjectively conceptualized and not on hard data and reality, the effect was that the navigational instruments of the quote Western ship were thrown overboard, and it sailed into the middle of a cyclone, in which it now tries to find its bearings. The disorientation was easily exploited by the regimes in Moscow and Beijing, using disinformation techniques to sow even greater confusion in the West. It seems that in this chaos, Americans have chosen an opposing course, but it is definitely too early to make definitive judgments. While American elites have broken free from the trap of woke ideology, and glimpses of reflection can be seen even among some Democrats or in liberal and leftist media, it is not said that in the violent course of change, they will not fall into the vortex of techno-oligarchy excessive deregulation, neoconservatism, or quasi-authoritarianism. People will not stop in the pursuit of creating new concepts for interpreting reality. There is a risk that the current conservative movement will also degenerate and sink into its extremes, the effects of which we observed in the past. The pendulum of history does not cease, and it is precisely history that shows that the older the wisdom, the greater the probability that it will endure for the next thousands of years. Movements like woke appear and disappear over the course of decades. Meanwhile, Christianity, Buddhism, or even excluding religions, Stoicism, withstand the pressure of successive generations for thousands of years.